Nora Whitfield had rehearsed the speech in the elevator, in the hallway, and twice more standing outside apartment 4B with her knuckles hovering an inch from the door. By the time she actually knocked, the words had gone soft and useless in her mouth, the way carefully built things always did the moment they met reality. "Mr. Ashford," she said, when the door opened. "I know I'm late. I know it's the third month in a row. I just need one more week." He looked at her the way he always did, quiet, unreadable, standing in the doorway with the hallway light catching against unnaturally pale skin. Gabriel Ashford managed 6 buildings in this part of the city and lived, as far as anyone knew, in the plainest unit of the plainest one, which had always struck Nora as strange for a man who wore suits that looked tailored in another century. "One more week," he repeated, like he was turning the phrase over to check it for hidden costs. "I have a job interview Thursday. If it goes well, I'll have first and last month's rent to you by Friday, on top of what I already owe. I know landlords don't usually do this. I just don't have anywhere else to go if you don't." He was quiet long enough that she assumed the answer was no, and had already begun composing the next version of herself, the one who'd have to call her sister and admit defeat again, when he said, "1 week. Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise don't promise things you can't guarantee," he said, not unkindly, just flat. The way a man says something he's said many times before, to many different people, over many different years. "Just be here Friday with what you owe. Or don't be here at all." The door closed. Nora stood in the hallway a moment longer, feeling the particular mix of relief and humiliation that came with being granted mercy by someone who clearly resented giving it, and went back upstairs to apartment 6C, where her own rent was due in 9 days, and her bank account currently held $41. She worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner 3 blocks over, the kind of job that paid just enough to keep her afloat and not nearly enough to keep her from drowning slowly, instead of all at once. She'd moved to the city 8 months ago after her mother's funeral, when staying in the house she grew up in had become unbearable in ways she still hadn't found words for, and had discovered, the way most people eventually did, that starting over cost more than anyone warned you about. Thursday's interview went well enough that she allowed herself a small, careful hope on the walk home, a marketing assistant position at a firm 2 subway stops from her building, decent pay, benefits after 90 days. She didn't have a callback yet, but the interviewer had smiled at the end and said we'll be in touch soon in a tone that sounded like it meant something. Friday morning, she counted her tips from the week, added what remained of her last paycheck, and came up $400 short. She stood outside apartment 4B for a long time before she made herself knock. "I have most of it," she said, the moment the door opened. "Not all of it. I'm $400 short. I know I said Friday. I know I promised. I told you not to promise things," Gabriel said. "I know. I'm sorry. Please, I just need until Monday. My next check, Miss Whitfield." His voice cut through hers, quiet but absolute, the kind of quiet that ended conversations rather than continued them. "I've given you 2 extensions in a month. I run a business, not a charity. I know that. I do. Her voice cracked, and she hated it, hated that after everything, after her mother, after the move, after 8 months of just barely holding herself together, it was going to be this, standing in a hallway crying in front of a landlord who clearly wanted nothing more than to close the door. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't much the smallest loosening around the eyes, the kind of thing she might have imagined if she hadn't been staring so hard, looking for any sign of mercy at all. "Monday," he said. "Not because you've earned it. Because I don't want the hassle of processing an eviction on a Friday." "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the words could carry. He was already closing the door when she said, without meaning to, "You're not like other landlords." He paused. Meaning most of them would have had me out by now. "You keep bending. A little. even when you clearly don't want to. Don't mistake reluctance for kindness, he said. I simply find eviction paperwork tedious. And he closed the door before she could answer that, leaving her standing in the hallway with the distinct impression that she'd just been lied to, though she couldn't have said about what. Monday came, and with it, an email not the callback she'd hoped for, but a rejection, polite and generic, thanking her for her time and wishing her luck in her future endeavors. She read it twice on her lunch break at the diner, standing in the back hallway between the walk-in freezer and the dish pit, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very tired. She didn't have the rent. She wouldn't have it Friday, either, most likely, or the Friday after that. The math had stopped working weeks ago. She'd just been too stubborn to admit it. That night, walking home past 11, she took the shortcut through the alley behind Kessler Street, the one she usually avoided but was too exhausted to detour around. Halfway through, she heard the footsteps 2 sets, closing in from behind. Unhurried in the specific way that told her whoever it was had no reason to hurry, because they already knew she couldn't outrun what was coming. Just the bag, a voice said, close enough now that she could smell cigarettes and something sour underneath it. Phone, too. She turned, hands already lifting in surrender, and that was when a third shape moved out of the shadows ahead of her tall. Coat dark, moving with a stillness that felt wrong even before he spoke. I believe, the shape said, in a voice she recognized immediately and couldn't place fast enough to make sense of it, that you were told to leave her alone. The 2 men behind her went very quiet. One of them actually took a step back. Mr. Ashford? Nora said, staring. Because it couldn't be. Because her landlord did not belong in an alley at 11 at night, standing between her and 2 men who'd clearly recognized him on sight and were now backing away like he was something far more dangerous than a man who managed 6 residential buildings and hated eviction paperwork. Go home, Miss Whitfield, Gabriel said, not looking at her, eyes fixed on the 2 men who were already retreating into the dark at the alley's far end. I'll walk you the rest of the way. You knew them, Nora said, once the alley had emptied and her heartbeat had started to settle back into something resembling a normal rhythm. Those men, they knew you. They knew who I was, Gabriel said, walking beside her now, hands in his coat pockets. His pace matched exactly to hers in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. That's different from knowing me. They ran the second you spoke. Landlords don't usually have that effect on muggers. I have interests beyond property management, he said, which answered absolutely nothing and somehow closed the subject anyway, the way he always managed to do. They walked the rest of the way in silence. 6 blocks that felt longer than usual. Nora, too, rattled to make conversation, and Gabriel apparently content to let the quiet sit between them without filling it. At her building, he stopped at the door instead of following her in. You should take a different route home, he said. Kessler Street isn't safe at this hour. I know. I was tired. I wasn't thinking. Think next time, he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite concern. Not exactly, but close enough to it that she found herself studying his face for a longer moment than she meant to. Thank you, she said, for whatever that was back there. Don't mention it, he said, and the phrase carried an odd weight, like he meant it literally rather than as a courtesy. She went upstairs feeling stranger than she had any right to feel after simply being walked home, turning the night over in her mind while she lay awake the 2 men's fear, immediate and absolute, the way Gabriel hadn't raised his voice, hadn't needed to, the particular stillness in his posture that had reminded her, uncomfortably, of something she couldn't name. The rent conversation resumed on Wednesday, this time with Gabriel arriving at her door instead of the reverse, which had never happened before in 8 months of living in the building. I came to discuss your account, he said when she opened the door, and something in his tone made her brace for the eviction notice. she'd been expecting since Friday. "I don't have it," she said, before he could say anything else. "I'm not going to pretend I do. I lost the interview. I don't know when I'll have it." "I'm aware," he said. "I checked the email trail on the building's shared printer this morning. You'd left the rejection open in the browser." "You read my email?" "I read what was left open on a public printer," he said, without apology. "I'm not in the habit of invading privacy, Miss Whitfield, but I am in the habit of understanding my tenants' situations before deciding how to handle them. And what have you decided?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her in a way that felt less like a landlord assessing a delinquent tenant and more like something else entirely. Something she didn't have a category for yet. "I've decided you can work off part of what you owe," he said finally. "The building needs someone to manage evening inquiries, tenant complaints, minor administrative work, 3 evenings a week. It won't cover everything, but it will reduce what you owe considerably, and it will keep you from taking that alley home at 11 at night." "Why would you do that?" "Because eviction paperwork is tedious," he said, "and because a building manager who's also intimately familiar with financial hardship tends to handle tenant complaints with more empathy than the last one I hired, who called the police on a family for being 3 days late. Nora studied him, this quiet, strange man who owned 6 buildings and apparently hated paperwork more than he cared about strict enforcement of his own rules." "Okay," she said. "I'll take it. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen the complaint logs. Half the building thinks the radiators are haunted." It was, she'd later realize, the first joke she'd ever heard him make, delivered so flatly she almost missed it entirely. The job started that Friday, 3 evenings a week, in a small office off the lobby that smelled like old paper and had a single window looking out onto the street. Gabriel came by most evenings, ostensibly to check on her progress, though she began to suspect, as the weeks passed, that the visits had less to do with paperwork than either of them wanted to admit. "You never eat," she said, one evening in the 3rd week, watching him stand near the doorway rather than sit, a habit she'd noticed but never questioned. "I've worked here a month. I've never once seen you with coffee, or lunch or anything." "I eat," he said, "just not on a schedule you'd find visible." "That's a very evasive answer." "I'm a very evasive man," he said, and there was something almost fond in it, the ghost of that first flat joke about haunted radiators. "You're cold, too," she added, before she could stop herself. "Your hand, when you passed me those files last week. Actually cold. Not just normal cold like you'd been standing outside in winter." Something flickered across his face, not alarm, exactly, but the careful stillness of a man recalculating how much he'd revealed without meaning to. "Poor circulation," he said. "It's a family trait." That's the second evasive answer in 2 minutes. "I contain multitudes of evasive answers, Miss Whitfield. You'll have to get used to it." She laughed, surprised by how easily it came out, and didn't notice, until later, how carefully he'd watched her while she did, like the sound itself was something rare enough to catalog. The complaint logs, as promised, were absurd. A tenant on the 3rd floor insisted her radiator whispered at night. Another swore the elevator stopped on floor 7 even though the building only had 6. Nora learned to field these with a straight face, filing them under maintenance requests and quietly noting, in a private log she kept for herself, how many of them clustered around Gabriel's own floor. "Do you know anything about the 7th floor elevator thing?" She asked him one evening, half joking, half genuinely curious. "The building has 6 floors, he said. "That's what I told Mrs. Alvarez. She says the elevator disagrees. Mrs. Alvarez also believes her radiator whispers state secrets," Gabriel said. "I wouldn't put too much faith in her testimony regarding elevator mechanics." "You didn't answer the question. I answered the question you should have asked," he said, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated, never quite lying, never quite telling the whole truth either, threading a careful needle between the two that left her more curious with every conversation rather than less. Over the following weeks, small oddities accumulated the way snow gathers on a windowsill, each flake unremarkable on its own, the total impossible to ignore. He never appeared during the 2 hours around noon, no matter what building emergency arose. He signed all his paperwork with an elaborate, old-fashioned hand that looked more suited to a treaty than a lease agreement. Once, helping him carry a stack of files, her hand brushed his, and the cold of it wasn't just cold, it was absolute. The kind of cold that belonged to something that had never once been warm. Not the way people were. "You're staring," Gabriel said, without looking up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Your hand," Nora said. "It's freezing. Actually freezing, not metaphorically. I've never felt anything like it. I told you. Poor circulation. Poor circulation doesn't make skin feel like it's been in a freezer for an hour." He looked up then, and something in his expression made her breath catch not fear, not quite, but the sense of standing very close to the edge of something she didn't fully understand yet, and wasn't sure she was ready to. "You ask a great many questions for someone who's supposed to be grateful for a part-time job," he said, though there was no real reproach in it. "You give a great many non-answers for someone who saved me from being mugged in an alley 2 months ago. Perhaps we're evenly matched then, perhaps," she agreed, and held his gaze a beat longer than professional courtesy required, watching something shift behind his eyes that she didn't yet have the language to name. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late autumn, when a burst pipe on the 4th floor sent Nora up at nearly midnight to assess the damage before it could spread. She found the water shut off already, the mess mostly contained, and Gabriel standing in the hallway in shirt sleeves, hair slightly disheveled, looking more human and more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. "You fixed it yourself?" she asked, surprised. "I have some experience with emergency repairs," he said. "Centuries of managing property will do that." "Centuries," she repeated, half laughing, assuming it was another one of his dry jokes. "Sure. Very old building. Very old landlord." He didn't laugh back. He didn't say anything at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had, and in the quiet that followed she noticed, for the first time, the particular way the hallway's dim light seemed to slide off him, rather than catch against his skin the way it did with everyone else. "Gabriel," she said, slowly, testing the name the way you test ice before stepping onto it. "What are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, water still dripping somewhere behind him from the ruptured pipe, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before, lower, older, stripped of the careful landlord's cadence he usually wore like a second coat. "I think," he said, "that you already suspect the answer, and are simply waiting for permission to believe it. Try me. I'm not what I appear to be," he said. "I haven't been human in a very long time. The building, the rent collection, the tedious paperwork, it's a disguise, Miss Whitfield. A very convenient one that lets me exist among people without drawing the kind of attention my actual position would invite. Your actual position. I rule an enclave 2 districts from here," he said, "one most humans have never heard of, and are not meant to. I am, in the language you'd understand most easily, a king. Of vampires." He watched her face carefully as he said it, bracing, she realized, for the exact reaction most people would have: fear, disbelief, the slow retreat toward the nearest exit. Instead, Nora found herself thinking, absurdly, of every strange detail she'd catalogued over the past 2 months: the cold hands, the absent lunches, the elaborate signature, the men in the alley who'd fled at the mere sound of his voice, and felt each piece slide into place with an inevitability that left her strangely calm rather than afraid. "That explains the elevator thing," she said finally, and watched surprise crack through his careful composure for the first time since she'd known him. "That's your response," Gabriel said. 800 years of careful concealment, and you respond by making a joke about the elevator. I'm processing, Nora said. This is how I process. Give me a minute, then I'll get properly terrified. Take your time, he said, though something in his voice suggested he was almost amused, watching her work through the revelation at her own pace rather than the pace he'd clearly expected. So the landlord thing, she said slowly. That's not your whole life. You actually rule something. An enclave, you said. Sterling Enclave. 2 districts east, hidden behind a boundary most humans walk past without ever noticing it exists. I've governed it for the better part of 3 centuries. He said it plainly, without the weight she might have expected from a man confessing to centuries of power and responsibility. The building here is separate, my own arrangement, unrelated to enclave business. Why manage a building at all? You could live anywhere, do anything. Because I got tired, he said, and for the first time, something genuinely vulnerable slipped through the careful landlord's mask he usually wore. Of ruling. Of the endless formality of court, the constant performance of authority. I wanted something ordinary. Something with tedious paperwork and complaint logs about haunted radiators. I wanted, for a few hours a week, to be simply Gabriel Ashford, building manager, instead of the king of Sterling Enclave, and I ruined that by asking too many questions. You didn't ruin anything, he said, quickly enough that it surprised them both. If anything, you're the first person in decades who's made the ordinary version of myself feel worth maintaining. I kept extending your rent, Miss Whitfield, not out of some landlord's generosity I don't actually possess. I extended it because I found myself wanting an excuse to keep speaking with you. Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the strangeness of the moment, despite the impossible weight of everything he'd just told her. That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, or the strangest confession I've ever received from an 800-year-old vampire king. I've been informed it can be both, he said, and there was that flat, dry humor again, steadier now that the worst of the reveal had passed without her running for the door. They stood there a while longer, the burst pipe forgotten, the hallway quiet except for the last stubborn drip of water somewhere behind him, and Nora found herself studying his face, with new eyes, not the cautious landlord she'd known for 8 months, but the ancient, careful creature underneath, who'd apparently built an entire ordinary disguise just for the chance to feel human again, however briefly. Does anyone else know, she asked, about this? About Gabriel Ashford, tedious landlord? No one, he said. My counsel believes I spend my absences on private matters of state. Nigel, my steward, suspects, but has the good sense not to ask directly. So I'm the only human who knows the king of Sterling Enclave moonlights as a guy who argues about radiator ghosts. You're the only human who's ever asked the right questions long enough to force the truth out of me, he said. That's different from simply knowing. I chose to tell you. That matters, to me, more than you might realize. The weeks that followed took on a strange, layered quality daytime hours, where Gabriel remained precisely the landlord she'd always known, careful and formal, and evenings, increasingly, where the mask slipped further, revealing more of the man underneath the centuries of practiced restraint. He told her, slowly, about the enclave, about the delicate balance between vampire and human quarters that echoed uncomfortably close to the arrangement in the building itself, landlord and tenant, ruler and ruled, though neither of them ever said it quite that plainly. Come see it, he said, one evening in early winter, startling her with the suggestion. The enclave. Not the court, not the formal parts, just the market, the ordinary corners where I rarely go. You want to show me your other kingdom. I want to show you the parts of myself I don't usually let anyone see, he said. The enclave included. She went, the following Saturday, through a boundary she wouldn't have noticed on her own, even if she'd walked past it 100 times, into a district that existed in the strange overlap between hidden and simply overlooked, the way certain neighborhoods manage to stay invisible to those who aren't meant to find them. The market there ran quieter than any human one she'd known. Stalls tended by humans and vampires alike, an uneasy peace maintained through centuries of careful arrangement. "They bow to you," she said, watching heads turn and shoulders dip as they passed, even here, off duty. "Old habits," Gabriel said. "I've tried to discourage it. It persists regardless. Do you miss it? The formality, the power." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but less, lately, than I used to." He glanced at her, something unguarded in the look that hadn't been there in all the months of careful landlord courtesy. "I find I prefer the tedious paperwork, and the company that comes with it." "Careful," Nora said, smiling despite herself. "That's dangerously close to another compliment. You're going to ruin your reputation as an evasive man of mystery." "I contain multitudes," Gabriel said, echoing his own earlier line, and this time the humor sat easier between them, worn smooth by weeks of growing familiarity. They walked through the Enclave market a while longer, past stalls selling things Nora didn't fully recognize, dried herbs meant for purposes she couldn't guess, small vials of something dark and glassy, bread from a bakery that apparently served both quarters equally. Gabriel bought nothing, though he lingered at a stall selling old books, running his fingers along the spines with the particular reverence of a man who'd read most of them the first time they were published. "You collect books," she said. "I collect a great many things, over centuries. Books simply survive better than most. Do you have a library?" "An actual one, not just a modest one," he said. "In the Enclave residence. I'd show you, if you're not opposed to seeing where the King of Sterling Enclave actually sleeps, rather than the plain apartment he pretends to occupy 3 days a week." "I'm not opposed," she said, and meant it more than the casual tone let on. The residence, when they reached it, was nothing like the modest building apartment she knew. Tall ceilings, dark wood, shelves of books stretching higher than she could reach, without a ladder Gabriel produced from some hidden alcove, with the ease of long practice. She spent an hour simply wandering the shelves, while he watched from a chair near the unlit fireplace. Content, it seemed. To let her explore at her own pace, rather than narrate every detail. "This is where you actually live," she said eventually, settling into the chair across from him. "Not the building, not the tedious landlord thing." "This is where I exist," he corrected. "I'm not certain I've truly lived anywhere in longer than I can properly recall. Existing and living aren't quite the same thing in my experience. And which one is this? Right now. Me, in your actual home, asking too many questions again." He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything, weighing it the way she imagined he'd once weighed treaties and wars. "This," he said slowly, "feels closer to living than anything I've done in longer than I can count." Something passed between them then, unspoken but unmistakable, the accumulation of months of careful evasions finally giving way to something plainer, more honest. Nora reached across the small distance between their chairs and took his cold hand in hers, the way she'd wanted to for weeks, without quite admitting it to herself. "You're still cold," she said. "I will always be cold," he said. "I did warn you, in a manner of speaking. Poor circulation, I believe I called it." "Family trait," she said, smiling. "Very convincing lie, by the way." "I've had 800 years of practice at convincing lies," he said. "This is, I think, the first time I've been glad to have one uncovered." The following months passed in the strange, layered rhythm they'd built together, building manager by day, Enclave visits by evening. The careful negotiation between two very different worlds that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, began to fold into something workable. Nora kept her job at the building, kept paying rent, though Gabriel had quietly stopped charging her for it in any meaningful sense weeks before either of them acknowledged it out loud. Trouble arrived, as it inevitably does, from a direction neither of them had thought to watch closely enough. It came in the form of a council member named Thessaly, an ancient, severe vampire who'd served under 3 previous rulers before Gabriel and viewed his fondness for the human quarter, and for one particular human, as a dangerous indulgence bordering on treason against the old order. "The council has noticed your absences," Thessaly said, cornering Gabriel in the Enclave's formal hall one evening while Nora waited outside, close enough to hear most of the conversation through the heavy door. "Your visits to the human district." The woman. "My personal matters are not the council's concern," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into the formal register Nora had come to recognize as his ruling voice, distinct from the quiet landlord's tone he used with her. "They become the council's concern when they threaten the arrangement that's kept this enclave stable for 3 centuries, Thessaly said. "A king distracted by a mortal is a king vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation our enemies have waited generations to find." "Is that a threat, Thessaly?" "It's a warning," the older vampire said. "Given out of loyalty, not malice. End the entanglement, or the council will find a way to end it for you." Nora didn't wait for Gabriel to relay the conversation. She stepped through the doorway before either of them noticed her, chin lifted, refusing to let the fear pooling in her stomach show on her face. "I heard that," she said. "All of it." Thessaly turned, cold assessment sliding over her the way she imagined he'd once assessed enemy armies before deciding whether they were worth destroying. "Then you understand the position you've placed your king in," he said. "I haven't placed him anywhere," Nora said. "He came to my door himself, the first night in that alley. He's the one who kept extending rent he didn't have to extend. If anyone's been doing the choosing here, it's him." "Choices have consequences," Thessaly said, "even for kings. Especially for kings." "Enough," Gabriel said, and the single word carried enough weight that even Thessaly's carefully composed expression flickered. "Miss Whitfield is under my protection. Any action taken against her will be taken against me directly. I trust that's clear enough, even for the council's more traditional members." Thessaly studied him a long moment, some old and complicated calculation passing behind his eyes, and finally inclined his head, not quite a bow, but close enough to concession that Nora felt the tension in the room ease slightly. "As you say, my king. But I would remind you that the council's patience, like most things in this enclave, is not infinite." He left without another word, and Gabriel exhaled slowly once the door closed, a habit he'd apparently kept from his human life despite no longer needing the breath. "That wasn't nothing," Nora said. "Was it? The way he said end it for you?" "No," Gabriel admitted. "It wasn't nothing. Thessaly has survived 3 centuries of court politics by being both patient and thorough. He won't act rashly, but he won't forget this conversation either. What does that mean for us?" "It means we should be careful," Gabriel said. "Not secretive, I won't hide you, not after everything, but careful. Thessaly isn't the only council member who will see this as a vulnerability to exploit." The weeks that followed carried a new undercurrent of tension beneath the ordinary rhythm they'd built. Small warnings, accumulating the way storm clouds gather before anyone quite admits a storm is coming. Nora noticed unfamiliar faces near the building more often than usual, vampires who lingered a beat too long near the entrance before moving on. Gabriel grew quieter during his enclave visits, more guarded, the formal ruling voice slipping into his conversations with her more frequently than it had in months. "You're pulling away," she said one evening, watching him stand near the doorway of her small apartment rather than sit, the old distance creeping back into his posture. "I'm being cautious. You're being distant. There's a difference, and you taught me that distinction yourself, if you remember." Something in his expression cracked, the careful composure giving way to something more raw underneath. "Thessaly isn't wrong, Nora. Not entirely. A king distracted is a king vulnerable, and there are those in the Enclave who would use any weakness they can find against me. And against you." if it served their purposes. So what? You're going to end it? Because some ancient council member is worried about optics? I'm trying to protect you, he said, voice rough in a way she'd rarely heard from him. If distance is what keeps you safe from the kind of enemies I've made over 800 years, then distance is what I'll choose, however much I don't want to. That's not your choice to make alone, Nora said, standing to face him directly. I walked into this with my eyes open, Gabriel. I know what you are. I know what it costs to be near you. I'm still here. Don't you dare decide, on your own, that I can't handle the risk. He looked at her for a long moment, something warring behind his eyes, the centuries of careful rule pulling one direction, the plain human want he'd only recently rediscovered pulling the other. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally. Balance both. The crown and the this. Whatever this is. Then we figure it out together, she said. Same as everything else. You didn't handle Roman's collectors alone, back in that alley. You don't have to handle Thessaly alone either. Something eased in his shoulders, the distance he'd been building over the past weeks finally cracking under the plain, stubborn fact of her refusal to be pushed away. You're remarkably insistent, for someone who once begged me for a single extra week of rent. I contain multitudes, Nora said, echoing his own words back at him, and watched the ghost of a smile cross his face real, unguarded. The kind he rarely allowed himself even now. The confrontation with Thessaly, when it finally came, arrived faster and more directly than either of them expected. Word reached Gabriel on a cold evening in late winter that the council had called an emergency session, one Thessaly had convened without waiting for the king's formal approval, a breach of protocol serious enough that Gabriel's jaw tightened the moment Nigel relayed the message. He's moving against me, Gabriel said, already reaching for his coat. Calling a session without my presence is a direct challenge to my authority. He wouldn't risk that unless he believed he had enough support to make it stick. What does that mean for you? For us, it means Thessaly intends to formally challenge my fitness to rule, citing my attachment to you as evidence of compromised judgment. If enough council members support the challenge, it could trigger a formal vote of confidence, something no ruler of this enclave has faced in over a century. Can you win it? I don't know, Gabriel admitted, and the honesty of it frightened her more than any confident reassurance could have. 3 centuries of rule earns loyalty, but loyalty erodes quickly when fear is offered as an alternative, and Thessaly is very good at offering fear. She went with him to the enclave, despite his half-hearted attempt to insist she stay behind, and stood at the back of the formal hall while the council assembled a dozen ancient faces, some curious, some openly hostile, watching their king walk in with a mortal woman at his side rather than leaving her, as tradition demanded. At the boundary, you bring her into the formal hall, Thessaly said, before Gabriel had even reached his seat. A bold statement, my king, for a man about to be questioned on the grounds of compromised judgment. I bring her because she has as much right to witness this as any of you, Gabriel said. And because I have nothing to hide regarding my choices, unlike some in this room, whose loyalty has shifted rather more conveniently than principle would suggest. A murmur ran through the assembled council, and Nora watched Thessaly's composure flicker for just a moment before settling back into its careful, ancient mask. The challenge stands, Thessaly said. A king who prioritizes a mortal attachment over the security of his enclave is a king whose judgment cannot be trusted. I call for a vote of confidence. What followed was the longest hour of Nora's life. Council members rising one by one to speak, some in support of Thessaly's challenge, citing tradition and the old fears of vulnerability. Others, to her surprise, speaking in Gabriel's defense, citing 3 centuries of careful, fair rule that had kept the enclave stable through wars and plagues and every manner of crisis the old world had thrown at it. He walked into a human alley to protect an innocent woman from ordinary criminals, one council member said, an older vampire Nora didn't recognize. Not enclave business. Not politics. Simple decency. At personal risk, expecting nothing in return. I would remind this council that our king has always led with exactly that kind of decency, long before this particular attachment began. The vote, when it finally came, fell in Gabriel's favor not overwhelmingly, but decisively enough that Thessaly's challenge collapsed under its own weight, the older vampire's face settling into a cold, contained fury he made no attempt to fully hide. "This isn't finished," Thessaly said quietly, as the council dispersed. "You've won a vote, my king. You haven't won the argument." "Perhaps not," Gabriel said. "But I've won enough for now to continue as I choose. That will have to be sufficient, Thessaly, whether it satisfies you or not." They left the formal hall together, Nora's hand finding his cold one in the corridor outside, and for the first time since Thessaly's initial warning, she felt the tension in Gabriel's shoulders ease into something like relief. That was terrifying, she admitted, once they were clear of the hall. "It was," Gabriel agreed. "I won't pretend otherwise. Thessaly isn't finished. Not truly. Men like him rarely accept defeat gracefully. But we've bought time, and time, in my experience, has a way of resolving what impatience cannot." "So, what now?" "Now," Gabriel said, "we go back to the tedious business of collecting rent and filing complaints about haunted radiators, and we let the enclave settle around tonight's result. And perhaps," he added, something warmer entering his voice, "we find dinner. An ordinary one. I find I've missed the ordinary parts of this over the past few weeks of careful distance. You don't eat. I've been informed I should try harder to maintain the habit. For appearances if nothing else," he said, and the dry humor of it, restored now after weeks of tension, made her laugh out loud in the quiet enclave corridor, the sound echoing pleasantly against walls that had heard, that evening, far more serious things. The months that followed carried a hard, one quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed but before anyone fully trusts the calm. Thessaly retreated into cold formality, offering no further direct challenges, though Nora noticed the way he watched them both whenever enclave business brought them into the same room, patient, calculating, the particular stillness of someone who had simply changed strategies rather than abandoned the fight. Gabriel resumed his split existence with renewed purpose, though something had shifted in how he carried it, less like a disguise worn out of necessity, more like a genuine choice he made each day, weighing the ordinary tedium of building management against the weight of ruling and finding, increasingly, that he preferred to spend as much time as possible in the version of himself that argued about radiator ghosts and forgot to eat lunch. "You've been humming," Nora said one evening, watching him review tenant files in the small office off the lobby, an old, tuneless melody that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "Have I? For the past 10 minutes. I didn't think you knew any songs written after your first century. I contain more surprises than you'd credit me for," he said, though the ghost of embarrassment crossing his face suggested he hadn't been entirely aware of the habit until she'd pointed it out. "It's nice," she said. "Hearing you do something so ordinary. Unguarded, I find myself unguarded rather more often, lately," he admitted. "I'm still adjusting to what that means, after so long spent guarding everything, out of necessity." She crossed the small office and settled into the chair beside his desk, close enough that the familiar cold radiating from him no longer registered as strange, only as simply another fact about the man she'd come to love over the past year as constant and unremarkable, by now, as his careful evasions or his dry, understated humor. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "About before. About who you were when you were still human." He set down the file he'd been reviewing, giving her his full attention in the way he did whenever a question mattered enough to warrant it. "You can ask. I don't promise a complete answer. Some of it has faded, over 8 centuries, more than I'd like to admit. What do you remember? Anything at all?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over the way he turned over everything, carefully, without haste. "I remember being poor," he said finally. "Genuinely poor, in a way this modern poverty doesn't quite capture. Though I recognize the shape of your hardship echoes something of my own, all those centuries ago. I remember a debt my family owed a local lord, one that threatened to take our small farm entirely. I remember being turned not by choice, but by a vampire who saw usefulness in a desperate young man willing to trade anything for a way to save his family's land. Did it work? Saving your family? For a time," he said, something old and unresolved moving behind his eyes. "I paid the debt, using resources my new nature afforded me. My family kept the farm. I never told them what I'd become, and by the time I found the courage to return, decades had passed, and they were gone, and the farm belonged to strangers who had no memory of the family that once worked it. That's a terrible price," Nora said quietly. "It was the price available to me. At the time," Gabriel said. "I've spent centuries since then unlearning the particular arithmetic that convinced me any price was acceptable if it saved something I loved. I'm not certain I've fully unlearned it, even now. Is that why you kept extending my rent?" she asked, understanding, suddenly some deeper current beneath his early kindness that she hadn't fully grasped before. "Because it reminded you of your own family's debt." "Perhaps," he admitted. "Though it became something else, quickly enough. I didn't keep extending your rent out of guilt for old debts, Nora. I kept extending it because I found myself wanting to see you again, every week, more than any careful landlord's calculation could explain." She reached for his hand, cold and familiar, and held it a long moment in the quiet office, the tuneless hum he'd been humming earlier settling into something like contentment between them, unspoken, but entirely understood. "Marry me," Gabriel said, so quietly, and so suddenly, that she almost missed it entirely, the words slipping out with none of his usual careful deliberation, as though they'd simply overflowed some barrier he'd been maintaining for longer than either of them realized. "What?" "I don't have a ring prepared. I hadn't planned to ask tonight, or in this office, surrounded by tenant complaint logs about haunted radiators. But I find, having said it, that I don't wish to take it back. Marry me, Nora, not the enclave version, not some formal ceremony bound by 3 centuries of tradition and council oversight, though that will likely follow eventually, given who I am. Simply marry me. The plain, ordinary version. The one who forgets to eat lunch and hums songs he doesn't remember learning." Nora felt her chest tighten with something too large for words. 8 months of impossible circumstance folding into a single, overwhelming certainty. "Yes," she said. "Yes, obviously yes, though you should know I'm going to tell this story for the rest of my life exactly as it happened, complaint logs and all. I'd expect nothing less," Gabriel said, and kissed her there in the small office, cold lips against warm ones. 800 years of careful restraint finally, fully given over to something he'd apparently been building toward since the first night he'd granted her a single extra week of rent she hadn't deserved and he hadn't needed to give. The wedding, when it finally happened, took a form neither the enclave nor Nora's small circle of human friends fully anticipated. A quiet ceremony held at dusk in the enclave's central garden, human and vampire guests mingling with careful, curious courtesy, Thessaly present, but silent, his cold disapproval tempered, if not erased, by the plain fact of the council's earlier vote and the king's evident happiness. Nora's sister flew in for the occasion, having been let in on the truth only weeks before, and spent most of the reception alternating between wide-eyed fascination and the particular exhaustion of someone processing entirely too much information at once. "You're marrying a vampire," she said, for perhaps the 10th time that evening, watching Gabriel across the garden in conversation with a council member. An actual, honest vampire. 800 years old. "I know," Nora said. "I've had longer to get used to the idea than you have, Does he actually not eat? At all? He eats for appearances, mostly, and because I asked him to keep trying, since he's oddly bad at faking it convincingly. This is insane, her sister said, though there was no judgment in it, only the particular awe of watching someone she loved find happiness in the strangest possible circumstances. You deserve this, though. After everything with Mom, after moving here with nothing, you deserve something this enormous. Nora watched Gabriel across the garden, dusk light settling gold and soft over the enclave in a way she suspected he'd arranged deliberately, remembering, perhaps, some old fondness for exactly this kind of light from a life he could barely recall otherwise. I do, she said, quietly, mostly to herself. I think I finally do. The evening wound down slowly, enclave and human guests gradually parting ways at the boundary, Thessaly departing last with a final, unreadable look at the newly married king that Nora chose, for once, not to worry over too closely. Gabriel found her near the garden's edge as the last guests filtered out, dusk finally giving way to full night, the particular hour when he seemed most fully himself, unburdened by the daylight hours that had never quite belonged to him. You survived a formal enclave wedding, he said. I confess I wasn't entirely certain you would, given how thoroughly Nigel insisted on the traditional protocols. I survived worse, Nora said. A parking garage, an alley, an entire council trying to end our relationship over politics. A wedding with slightly too much ceremonial bowing was comparatively manageable. I'm glad you find it manageable, Gabriel said, drawing her closer against the cool evening air. I find, myself, that I've never been more grateful for a single extra week of rent than I am tonight, looking back on how thoroughly it changed the shape of everything that followed. You almost didn't give it to me, she reminded him. You were fully prepared to evict me over $400. I was prepared to do a great many things I'm grateful, now that I didn't do, he said. 800 years teaches patience, Nora, but it doesn't always teach a person to recognize the exact moment worth waiting for finally arrives. I nearly missed it entirely, buried under tedious paperwork and careful evasions. But you didn't miss it. No, he agreed, quiet and certain, in the particular way he reserved for the truths that mattered most. I didn't, and I don't intend to spend whatever remains of this very long life taking that for granted, not for a single day of it. They stood together in the quiet garden long after the last guests had gone, the enclave settling into its familiar nighttime rhythm around them, and Nora found herself thinking, not for the first time, of that terrified evening months ago when she'd stood outside apartment 4B, rehearsing a speech that had ultimately mattered far less than the simple, stubborn fact of asking for one more week, a request that had, against every reasonable expectation, unraveled into an entire impossible life she wouldn't have traded for anything. One more week, she said, half to herself, remembering. What? That's how this started. Me, begging for one more week of rent, having no idea I was begging the actual king of Sterling Enclave. An inauspicious beginning for an ending this happy, Gabriel said, something like genuine wonder in his voice, the particular tone of a man who'd spent 8 centuries expecting very little, and had somehow, finally, been given considerably more than he'd ever thought to hope for. I'll take it, Nora said, and kissed him again in the quiet enclave garden, warm lips against cold ones, the strange and impossible arithmetic of their entire unlikely story finally, fully balanced in her favor. Life settled, in the months that followed the wedding, into a rhythm neither of them had quite dared to imagine during the earlier turbulence of Thessaly's challenge and the careful weeks of forced distance that had preceded it. Gabriel maintained both halves of his existence, landlord and king, though the balance between them had shifted permanently, the ordinary tedium of building management no longer a temporary escape from his true responsibilities, but a genuine and equal part of who he'd chosen to be, Nora kept her position managing the building's evening affairs, though her role expanded gradually as trust between her and the Enclave grew into something closer to an unofficial liaison between the human tenants and the strange hidden world that occasionally brushed against their ordinary lives without most of them ever fully realizing it. "Mrs. Alvarez still insists the radiator whispers," she told Gabriel one evening, months into their marriage, both of them settled in the modest apartment that remained, despite everything, one of their favorite places to simply exist together. I finally admitted to her that some of the building's oddities have unusual explanations. She took it remarkably well. Did she? She asked if the whispering radiator was in fact a ghost, and when I said probably not, she seemed almost disappointed. I think she'd rather have a haunted radiator than a mundane maintenance issue. "People generally prefer the extraordinary explanation," Gabriel said, "provided it doesn't threaten them directly. It makes the ordinary world feel less arbitrary, I think, to believe something larger is happening just beneath the surface of things." "Is that why you chose this?" Nora asked. "The plain apartment, the tedious paperwork. Something ordinary, layered over something extraordinary, so the weight of the larger thing doesn't crush you entirely?" Gabriel considered the question with his usual careful seriousness, turning it over the way he turned over everything that mattered. "I think," he said finally, "I chose it because I'd forgotten, somewhere across 8 centuries, that a life could hold both things at once. That ruling an enclave and arguing about radiator ghosts weren't mutually exclusive, provided I had someone worth doing both for." "Sappy," Nora said, smiling despite the warmth spreading through her chest. "For a man who once answered every personal question with poor circulation as a family trait." "I contain multitudes," Gabriel said, for what felt like the 100th time since she'd first heard him say it, and she laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, filling the small ordinary apartment that had somehow become the center of an entirely extraordinary life. Thessaly's opposition never fully vanished, settling instead into a wary, watchful truce that both Gabriel and Nora learned to navigate with the particular caution 800 years of court politics demanded. But the council's earlier vote held, the Enclave's stability endured, and the quiet, ordinary rhythm they'd built together, rent collection and complaint logs by day, Enclave business and centuries-old responsibility by night became, against every reasonable expectation, simply the shape of their shared life. On the anniversary of that first desperate knock at apartment 4B, Nora stood again outside the same door, this time with a small, private smile rather than a rehearsed speech, and knocked the way she once had, purely out of sentiment. "Mr. Ashford," she said, when Gabriel opened the door, playing along with the old formality for old time's sake. "I'm afraid I'm late on my rent again." "Are you?" Gabriel said, matching her tone exactly, something warm and amused flickering behind his careful landlord's mask. "How unfortunate. I suppose I'll have to extend you 1 more week." "Just 1? "Perhaps," he said, drawing her inside, the door closing behind them on an evening exactly like the one that had started everything. "I could be persuaded to extend considerably longer than that, given the circumstances." "How much longer?" "I was thinking," Gabriel said, kissing her softly in the doorway of the same plain apartment where an impossible story had first, quietly, begun. "Somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 years, give or take. I find I have rather a lot of practice with that particular timeline." "I'll take it," Nora said, exactly as she had the very first time he'd extended her mercy she hadn't earned and he hadn't needed to give, and closed the door on the ordinary evening that had become, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened. The beginning of forever. The final chapter of their story, if it could be called an ending at all, came not through any grand confrontation or dramatic reveal, but through the slow, steady accumulation of ordinary days that neither of them had ever expected to be given in such abundance. Winter turned to spring, and Nora finally opened the small consulting business she'd quietly dreamed of since her marketing background first drew her to the city, advising Enclave-adjacent human businesses on navigating the delicate, often invisible boundary between the two worlds, a role that suited her particular talent for asking exactly the right uncomfortable questions. Gabriel's balance between crown and quiet held steadier than either of them had dared hope, Thessaly's opposition softening over the following year into something almost like grudging respect, forged slowly through Gabriel's continued fair governance and Nora's evident, undeniable value to an enclave that had, for centuries, kept itself too rigidly separate from the human world it depended on. "The council approved your proposal today," Gabriel told her one evening, settling into the chair across from her in the small office that had once been the site of tedious tenant complaints and had gradually become something closer to a second, more comfortable throne room. The formal liaison position. Thessaly voted in favor, which I confess surprised me more than the vote itself. "Did he say why?" "He said," Gabriel replied, something wry entering his voice, "that a woman who could survive both a mugging and an entire council session determined to end her relationship with their king had clearly earned the position through sheer, stubborn attrition, whatever his personal reservations about the broader precedent." High praise from Thessaly. The highest he's capable of giving, I suspect. Gabriel reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking her hand in his, cold as it had always been, and no longer strange at all, simply familiar, simply hers. "I find myself grateful, rather often, for how thoroughly you refuse to be intimidated by any of this. Not Thessaly, not the council, not even the plain, impossible fact of what I am. You make it easy," Nora said. "Most impossible things, once you spend enough time with them, stop feeling quite so impossible. They just feel like Tuesday." An excellent way to describe 800 years of careful concealment, finally undone by one persistent, underpaid diner waitress who wouldn't stop asking questions. "I was a marketing assistant applicant, thank you, before I was a diner waitress," Nora said, laughing. "Try to keep my resume straight." "My apologies," Gabriel said, kissing her hand with the particular old-fashioned formality he still slipped into occasionally, more out of fondness now than habit. "I'll endeavor to remember your full and complicated employment history more precisely, going forward." They sat together a while longer in the quiet office, the building settling into its familiar evening rhythm around them, tenants coming and going in the lobby below, entirely unaware of the extraordinary arrangement quietly governing the ordinary building they called home. Somewhere above them, Mrs. Alvarez's radiator continued its faint, mysterious whispering, a mundane maintenance issue that had, in the end, never fully needed explaining. "One more week," Nora said again, softly, the old phrase settling into something closer to a private ritual between them now than the desperate plea it had once been. That's really all it took. One more week, and I had no idea what I was actually asking for. "None of us ever do," Gabriel said, "when it matters most. We simply ask for what we need in the moment and trust that the answer, however strange it turns out to be, is somehow exactly the one we were meant to receive." Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening rhythms, entirely unaware of the vampire king who managed 6 residential buildings under an assumed and thoroughly convincing disguise, or the woman who'd once begged him for mercy and found, instead, an entire extraordinary life waiting patiently behind his careful, cold, endlessly patient hands. In the years that followed, the story of Gabriel Ashford, tedious landlord and hidden vampire king, and Nora Whitfield, the desperate tenant who'd unknowingly begged mercy from royalty, became something of a quiet legend within the careful, hidden world of Sterling Enclave, not told openly, not written into any formal record, but passed between trusted council members and human liaisons alike as proof that the old, rigid boundaries between the two worlds could, under the right circumstances, bend without breaking entirely. Thessaly, in his own grudging way, became something like an ally rather than an adversary, his opposition never fully vanishing, but softening into the particular respect that comes from watching a prediction fail to materialize despite every reasonable expectation that it should have. The Enclave's stability held, strengthened rather than weakened by the very attachment he'd once warned would prove its undoing. Nora's small consulting practice grew steadily, becoming an essential, quietly celebrated bridge between the human quarter and the Enclave. Her particular talent for navigating impossible circumstances with plain, stubborn honesty, proving as valuable to Sterling Enclave's continued survival as any formal diplomatic training could have provided. She never fully lost the instinct that had first driven her to knock on apartment 4B's door with a rehearsed, desperate speech, the instinct to ask for exactly what she needed, plainly and directly, and trust that the answer, however strange, would eventually make sense. Gabriel, for his part, never fully abandoned the small, tedious apartment that had once served as his disguise and had gradually become something closer to genuine sanctuary, the one place, among all his centuries of careful rule and formal responsibility, where he could simply exist as Gabriel Ashford, forgetful of lunch, prone to humming half-remembered songs, endlessly patient with radiator complaints that were never, in the end, quite as mysterious as Mrs. Alvarez insisted. On quiet evenings, long after the formal business of ruling an enclave and managing 6 residential buildings had settled into its familiar, well-worn rhythm, they would sometimes return to the same hallway outside apartment 4B, purely out of sentiment, and reenact the old ritual that had started everything. Nora's soft knock, her half-joking plea for one more week, Gabriel's carefully measured response, both of them smiling through the performance of a scene that had once carried the full weight of desperate uncertainty, and now carried only the warm, settled comfort of a story they both loved telling. One more week, Nora would say, every single time. And every single time, Gabriel would answer the same way, drawing her into the apartment that had become, over the years, simply home, rather than disguise. I find, he'd say, that I have considerably more than 1 week to offer. As it happens, I have quite a lot of time. And Nora, standing in the doorway of the ordinary apartment, where an impossible 800-year love story had quietly, improbably begun, would simply smile, take his cold, familiar hand in her warm one, and step inside, exactly as she had the very first time, grateful, uncertain, and completely unaware, in that original terrified moment, of just how much mercy she'd actually been asking for, and just how much more she'd eventually receive in return. The final measure of their story came not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of ordinary years that stretched ahead of them, both Gabriel's centuries continuing forward, as they always had, Nora's own life folding gradually, deliberately, into the strange rhythm of an existence split between human ordinary and enclave extraordinary, a balance she'd learned, over time, to carry as naturally as Gabriel carried his own dual existence. She never stopped working the small office off the building's lobby, though her responsibilities there had long since expanded far beyond tenant complaints and rent collection into something closer to genuine partnership in governing the delicate, careful arrangement between 2 worlds that had coexisted, uneasily, for centuries before she'd ever knocked on apartment 4B's door. Thessaly, in his final years before retreating into the quieter ceremonial role reserved for the Enclave's eldest council members, once admitted to her, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, that he'd been wrong to view her presence as a weakness in Gabriel's rule. "I believed attachment made a king vulnerable," he said, during one of the formal council sessions Nora now regularly attended in her official capacity. "I've come to understand, watching the 2 of you these past years, that I had the equation precisely backward. It was never attachment that weakened him. It was the isolation before it, the centuries spent believing he had to rule entirely alone, that left him vulnerable in ways attachment never could. That's almost a compliment, Thessaly. Don't grow accustomed to it, the old vampire said, though something almost warm flickered behind his ancient, careful eyes. I remain fundamentally opposed to sentiment as a governing principle. I simply concede, on the specific evidence available, that this particular sentiment appears to have strengthened rather than weakened the enclave it once threatened to destabilize. Nora carried that grudging concession home to Gabriel that evening, relaying it with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd finally won a long, quiet argument through sheer patient persistence rather than any single decisive victory. He called it evidence, she told Gabriel, settling into the familiar chair across from him in the modest apartment they still, after everything, considered home. Like we're a scientific study he's grudgingly forced to accept the results of. That's very like Thessaly, Gabriel said, something fond entering his voice despite the old tension that had once defined their relationship. He'll never fully abandon his caution. But grudging acceptance, from a man like him, carries more weight than enthusiastic praise from anyone else in that council. So we won. We won, Gabriel agreed, slowly, over years rather than any single dramatic confrontation, which I suspect is the only kind of victory that actually holds, in the end. The dramatic ones rarely last. The slow, patient ones tend to become simply the shape of things, eventually, indistinguishable from how the world was always meant to be. Nora leaned into him, cold and familiar and entirely hers, and thought back, as she often did on quiet evenings like this one, to the terrified young woman who'd once stood outside apartment 4B, rehearsing a desperate speech about needing one more week, having absolutely no idea that the ordinary, exhausted landlord on the other side of that door carried 800 years of careful history, an entire hidden kingdom, and the particular, patient capacity to fall in love with exactly the kind of stubborn, questioning honesty she'd never once thought to hide from him. "One more week," she murmured, mostly to herself, the old phrase settling now into something less like a memory and more like a permanent fixture of the life they'd built together. "As many as you need," Gabriel said, exactly as he always did, and outside their small ordinary window, the city moved on entirely unaware of the extraordinary arrangement quietly, permanently settled within one modest, tedious apartment building mercy given, love found, and an impossible 800-year story finally, fully home. Years later, when Nora's sister asked her, over a quiet dinner during one of her increasingly rare visits, what she'd tell her younger self if given the chance, the terrified woman standing outside apartment 4B with a rehearsed speech about needing one more week, Nora considered the question longer than she expected to. "I don't think I'd tell her anything," she said finally. "I think I'd just let her ask the question exactly the way she did, terrified and honest and completely unprepared for what the answer would actually cost, and give her. Because everything that mattered afterward only happened because she was brave enough to knock on that door in the first place, without knowing what waited on the other side of it. Even knowing everything that came after? The council, Thessaly, all of it? Especially knowing all of that," Nora said, glancing toward the window where Gabriel stood in careful conversation with a visiting council member, long shadows stretching gold across the small garden they'd built behind the building over the years. A private, ordinary sanctuary, neither the enclave nor the human quarter fully claimed as their own. The hardest parts turned out to be worth exactly as much as the easiest ones. In the end. Maybe more. Her sister followed her gaze to where Gabriel stood, still recognizably the careful, formal landlord who'd once nearly evicted his own future wife over $400, and still, unmistakably, the ancient king who'd walked into a dark alley without hesitation to protect a woman he barely knew. "He still looks at you like that," her sister said. "Like he can't quite believe you're real. 800 years teaches a person not to expect much," Nora said, smiling, watching Gabriel glance over at the exact moment she spoke, some old instinct alerting him to her attention across the quiet garden. I think that's exactly why he still looks surprised. Every single day, still, like it might all disappear if he stops paying close enough attention. Gabriel crossed the garden toward them, the last of the evening light catching against features that had remained unchanged through decades of ordinary human years. Cold hand finding hers with the same familiar certainty it always had, since that very first night in the rain-slicked alley behind Kessler Street. "Conspiring against me?" he asked, settling beside her, the dry humor still fully intact after all these years. "Just remembering," Nora said, "how this all started. One more week. The most consequential single week in 8 centuries," Gabriel said, kissing her temple softly, the ancient king and the ordinary landlord folding as they always did, into exactly the same steady, patient man. "I find I'd relive every complicated moment of it again, without hesitation, simply to arrive back here. Even Thessaly's challenge? Even that," he said, "though I confess I'd prefer to skip directly to this part, if given the choice." The garden. The quiet. You, still asking questions I don't always have easy answers for. You love the questions. "I love you," Gabriel said simply. No careful evasion left in it at all. 800 years of guarded restraint finally, fully surrendered to the plain, stubborn woman who'd once begged him for mercy and given him, in return, an entire second life he'd never once thought to hope for. And in the quiet garden behind an ordinary building in an ordinary corner of the city, where a vampire king in disguise had once nearly turned away a desperate tenant over unpaid rent, the last golden light of evening settled softly over 2 people who'd built, from the smallest possible beginning, something that had lasted and would continue lasting far longer than either of them, even with all his centuries of patient experience, had ever quite dared to expect. For the 8th anniversary of that first knock on apartment 4B's door, Nora planned nothing formal, no grand gesture befitting 8 years married to the king of Sterling Enclave, only a quiet evening in the small garden they'd built together. The same modest space where Gabriel had finally, fully surrendered his careful distance all those years before. "You're thinking about the beginning again," Gabriel said, watching her expression from across the small table they'd set up beneath the same tree that had shaded their first real conversation as something more than landlord and tenant. "I think about it every year, around this time," Nora admitted. "How close it came to not happening at all. If you'd said no, that very first night, if I'd found somewhere else to go instead of knocking on your door. I very nearly did say no," Gabriel said. "I want you to know that honestly, even now. I'd extended no one that kind of mercy in decades, perhaps longer." Something about the particular desperation in your voice that night made me reconsider a decision I'd have made without hesitation for anyone else. "What was it? About my voice?" "Honesty," Gabriel said, after a moment's careful consideration. "You weren't performing desperation for my benefit, the way so many tenants over the centuries have learned to. You were simply, plainly terrified, and asking for exactly what you needed without any pretense at all. I'd forgotten, I think, how rare that particular kind of honesty actually is, after 800 years surrounded by careful performance and diplomatic evasion. So I got lucky." "We both did," Gabriel said, reaching across the small table for her hand, the familiar cold no longer even registering as unusual after nearly a decade together. "I've considered, more than once, what my life would look like now if I'd simply told you no that night, and let the eviction proceed as any reasonable landlord would have. I find I can't actually picture it clearly anymore. You've become too thoroughly woven into every version of my life I can imagine, even the ones that came before you. That's either deeply romantic or slightly concerning," Nora said, smiling. "I can't quite decide which." "I've been informed it can be both," Gabriel said, echoing words she'd said to him years before, in the alley outside his enclave's formal hall, back when 800 years of careful concealment had first, fully cracked open into something honest. They sat together in the quiet garden, as evening settled fully into night, the enclave and the human quarter both continuing their separate, ordinary rhythms around them, entirely unaware of the small, extraordinary anniversary being marked in this particular corner of an ordinary building one more week, given freely, that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become forever. One more week, Nora said, the old ritual phrase settling into the warm evening air between them. Always, Gabriel answered, exactly as he always did, drawing her close against the gathering dark. As many as you need, for as long as I have left to give them. Which, I find, given the particular arithmetic of my existence, may well turn out to be considerably longer than either of us ever thought to ask for. And beneath the quiet garden tree, in the fading gold light of an ordinary evening that had once, impossibly, begun with a desperate knock and a rehearsed speech about needing just one more week, the vampire king and the woman who'd unknowingly begged mercy from royalty settled into the simple, hard-won certainty of a love that had outlasted every reasonable expectation either of them had ever carried into that first terrified conversation, and showed no sign, after 8 years and 8 centuries combined, of ending any time soon.